Welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast, episode 15, A Brave New World. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
In this final episode of season 1 of our podcast, we're wrapping up with words of wisdom and advice, news on season 2, an exciting reveal for Remarkable Retail, all with the help of our guests, Anne Mezzenga and Chris Walton, co-CEOs of OmniTalk. Great interview. Really looking forward to that. But before that, Steve, you've got some exciting news. I've been itching to reveal it all season. What's going on? What's new?
Well, as it turns out, I will be coming out with a second edition of Remarkable Retail, which will be revised and expanded for the COVID-19 economy. It also features a new foreword by Sucharita Kodali from Forrester. So a bunch of new things, and that will be coming out April 13th in the US and Canada, and probably a couple weeks later in other global markets.
I know, we've touched on it and we've hinted. Season 1 of Remarkable Retail was meant kind of like an evergreen podcast, but timing being everything, you finished the book, was late December, right? By the time the galleys are done and everything's done. So very pre-COVID. I guess you were just like, okay, what would I change? Is that the approach you took for your second edition? Other than there's some great new art for the front to make it look different, but what's different about it in a kind of a snapshot? What's new?
Well, I think the biggest change, obviously, was COVID happened. My point of departure for the original edition was certainly that the pace of disruption was accelerating. But my, goal with the book was to really point out that retailers that weren't remarkable needed to really accelerate the pace of change, because basically the window of opportunity was closing on them very quickly. Clearly already it closed on some, but for those that were struggling, they really needed to up their transformation pace. So that was really the point. And really, to be honest, I was certainly worried that many retailers weren't going to have the time to do it. But I generally felt that many had 3, 4, 5 years perhaps to make that transformation. And then COVID came, and just about all those things I was worried about causing this reckoning got compressed. Fundamentally, the point of departure is different. Okay, now COVID has happened. We've largely seen the aftermath of that. What's next? But really the core principles, the 8 essentials of remarkable retail, they haven't changed. The second part of the book is not, which lays out the 8 essentials, really isn't that different other than just kind of updating some of the points. The first part's pretty substantially different. There's a new introduction. There's this foreword by Sucharita, as I mentioned, and a number of the key things that I lay out as kind of setting the table have been pretty dramatically revised and expanded. I think the book's about 40 pages longer as well.
Oh, well, it's interesting because I've behind the scenes, I've known this was coming. And as I've listened to you as reflected on the different episodes, I thought, what does this change anything? And as we went through the essentials, it was just more impetus, it made them more essential, so to speak.
Right.
As you ticked off each one of the boxes, and maybe, who knows, maybe some of them turned even into more table stakes than others. But I think the last two that we had, the memorable and radical, really still there was white space there to be innovative for retailers, whether you're essential. It's funny, essential took on a whole new meaning in the COVID era.
Right.
You became an essential retailer. We talked to Anne and Chris about, tailwinds and headwinds from the COVID era. Well, the final chapter of your book, The Brave New World, to me felt like you sitting down with the reader, so to speak, metaphorically with a cup of coffee and just talking about, okay, now that you know all this, and maybe you've absorbed some and maybe you're still thinking about some, how do we think about what comes next? So I like the tone of the episode from that perspective. And you start talking about this VUCA idea as you often do, put a frame around a broad discussion. Take us through this VUCA idea and what that acronym stands for, and how you decided to put that in your final and last chapter.
Yeah, I kind of actually decided to include this pretty late in the writing of the book. I came across it it's actually a concept, as I understand it, that comes from military strategy, but it started to be applied to the business world over the last few years. And as you mentioned, VUCA is an acronym, and it's V for volatility, U for uncertainty, C for complexity, and A for ambiguity. And the notion is that you have to accept that this is basically the world we live in. And of course, the irony is when I put that into the book, I certainly felt like, well, yeah, there's a tremendous amount of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, but boom, right? Along comes COVID, and that's just at a whole different dimension. So it both makes the point that a lot of change, sometimes catastrophic, can happen very quickly. But it's also, I think, a reminder, and I've kept it in the new edition of the book, but done some different things with it, that this is the world we live in, and that there's just a lot of uncertainty and volatility that's inherent to the world today, irrespective of whether how fast we get out of the pandemic or whether we have another kind of black swan event.
Well, as I've been turning my mind to post-COVID now that we've got some daylight on the horizon with what looks like some great vaccines. We've had a few setbacks, it seems, but fortunately, it sounds like the COVID era as we knew it will wrap up in 2021, but there's still a tremendous amount of uncertainty, right? Because what did COVID do? And we've talked about this over the podcast, structurally versus a short-term reaction. It'll be years before we unpack the learnings and experience in real time the changes in consumer behavior, for example. And you talk about this, you frame it as the wisdom of uncertainty. Uncertainty will continue post-COVID. We're in it today, but post-COVID, post-vaccine, uncertainty will still be the course of the day, right?
I believe so. I think there's a point here which is maybe just fundamentally about accepting that we know a lot less about how things are going to play out than we tell ourselves, right? I think we're biologically wired to want to control things to a certain degree. And so this creates this illusion that if I just study harder, plan more carefully, that I can affect outcomes in a pretty material way. And I think we've learned even pre-COVID, or many of us have learned, that that's really not the way it works. So I think this idea of accepting that we know a lot less about the future than we believe, and frankly, being humble about it. And I think if you accept that reality and you have a certain amount of humility about it, that actually brings you wisdom. There's this idea of a beginner's mind where, the expert thinks they know all the answers. I'm butchering the quote, but the expert thinks they know all the answers, but the amateur is open to a lot of possibilities. And I think that beginner's mind is really important. And part of what it means is, because the thing I think I followed up with in the book is this idea of life in beta, that we're always going to be testing. And again, I think that was very valid pre-pandemic. But if you haven't learned the lesson that you have to be extremely agile, that you have to have a lot of irons in the fire, that you need to be constantly experimenting, then I think you're really missing a lot of the positive lessons, perhaps, that the pandemic has taught us.
Well, you mentioned it a couple of times, and when I talk to senior executives, humility, humbled as in we can't anticipate everything. The COVID era has been a very humbling experience for many, and you continue, again, this is all pre-COVID, you draw this great analogy to the ocean and surfing in terms of being humble, right? That you can't overcome something as massive as the ocean, but you can, learn to surf.
Yeah, it's a quotation. It's been attributed to various people. Probably the origin of his meditation teacher, Jon Kabat-Zinn, who said, the waves are going to keep on coming, so we're going to have to learn to surf. And I think that's just true. It's just, there will always be disruption. There will always be things that come out of left field. Sometimes the waves come slowly. Sometimes they come quicker and higher. And so it's really about learning how to navigate the waves, not being in denial about it or trying to think somehow we can control this power that's really beyond our control. So I think it's a very fundamental principle, not only about embracing innovation, but how we need to lean into this new world we're facing. The other thing I think is this idea that we're never ready. And many people, of course, have written about this, but this constant polishing and studying and testing and all that kind of stuff. And one of my favorite quotes that I put in the book is from Saturday Night Live producer Lorne Michael's, where he says, the show doesn't go on because it's ready. It goes on because it's 11:30.
Right on. And as someone, great Canadian, call that out, Lorne Michael. And as someone who's been, for years organizing and running conferences. It's so true, right? It's happening. It's happening, and whether you are ready or not, you got to do it. And
that's one of the great lessons about COVID, right? Is, we talked about this many times. We talk about it with Chris and Ann a little bit, that why does it take a crisis for retailers to innovate? Well, part of that was like, it's 11:30. Like, you can't wait anymore. The show is starting and you have to do the best you can. And unfortunately, in more normal times, right, it's a little easier to kick the can down the road or say, well, we need a little bit more research, or, I need to polish my PowerPoint a little bit more. And that hesitation and equivocation can really be the death knell for lots of projects, lots of companies. And so trying to create that sense of urgency, I think, is certainly a difficult thing, but accepting that we're never ready and sometimes we just got to ship that product or take that plunge is really, I think, critical to navigate this new world.
Well, that's a great segue into our conversation. So let's listen to our interview with Ann and Chris Walton. Ann Mezzenga and Chris Walton, and let's have a listen.
Super excited to have Ann and Chris here from OmniTalk and a bunch of other things. So thanks for joining us today. I'd love to start things off just by having you maybe each introduce yourself and talk a little bit about the work you do.
Sure. I'm Ann Mezzenga. I'm one of the co-founders of OmniTalk. Steve, you're right. There's a lot of other stuff going on too. We've been hard at work the last few years since Chris and I started this, experimenting and really focusing on where the future of retail is headed. Chris and I met back working on Target's Store of the Future project, and since then have been exploring, reading, writing, and podcasting about retail and innovation in retail specifically.
Yeah, Steve, thanks for having us too, I think. And, to Ann's point, we met on the Store of the Future at Target. And then as that project came to an end, we spent about 6-7 more months at Target. I think, Ann, if memory serves, I think you were pregnant at the time, and we started having a conversation. Right. No, you had just had your baby, actually. I should say we were both. And we had a conversation saying, hey, we think there's something here. I had started writing like a blog, which I called OmniTalk at the time, and it just stuck. And I started writing and talking about the future of retail. My first article was comparing Amazon to the Vietnam War. And the next thing I knew, people were reading it. And I kept writing more articles, and people kept reading those. And so I said to Ann, hey, let's I think we can start something here, because we saw an opportunity. And I think you guys will appreciate this, Steve, you especially, but we saw an opportunity for real candid and also what we like to call humorous conversation about, what's going on in the industry. A lot of what you see in the industry is put out by, journalists, people in media. But when you take the perspective of a real retailer and you're able to talk about things, especially as retail is changing, especially as retail technology becomes more and more important. And so with our backgrounds, we saw an ability to do something that we thought was unique and a good niche for us. And so then, lo and behold, we made the jump. We became entrepreneurs. The blog has taken off over the last 3 years. We're into podcasting, video production. I'm a senior contributor for Forbes. And even now, we're still trying to be real retailers, too. So just in the past month, we actually opened up our own e-commerce business called urbanroostershop.com, where we try to eat what we cook in terms of the content we're putting out in the marketplace as well.
I don't know how you guys get any sleep. To the extent we do so much similar things, I'm usually exhausted just by reading your stuff and watching your videos and whatnot.
Yeah, I was going to say, does time move differently in Minneapolis? Because by the sounds of it, you seem to pack a lot into a short amount of time.
We do a ton of stuff. Mr. and Mrs. OmniTalk would ask us that same question quite frequently, but yeah, somehow we managed to get it all done.
Particularly given the amount that you do, it's really terrific. And I find myself frequently recommending pretty much all that you guys do. Maybe we can get the conversation started, since you did spend a fair amount of time at Target. Target's one of those companies that I certainly have loved for a long time, but there was a period where they seemed to stall out. And in the last few years, sometimes talk about this as the stores strike back, where some of these legacy retailers that people were worried were too mature or were going to get out Amazon by Amazon ended up really reinventing themselves. And really even before the pandemic, maybe we can talk about how they've responded in the pandemic. But can you tell us a little bit about your experience there and what you think Target did that other retailers perhaps can learn from?
Yeah, actually, I think we have a unique position or vantage point to that question too, Steve. So at the time, like around 2011, I made the decision to go out in the field and learn how to run stores for Target. So I was out in Colorado running stores in Wyoming, Nebraska, South Dakota, learning that side of the business. And in 2013, I came back. And I think that year was a seminal moment in Target's history too, because Target just a few years earlier had come off the Amazon platform. E-commerce was rough. It had never really been given its just due. And Target brought a lot of great people into the organization at that time. People like Jason Goldberg or Don Block, people that had really great e-commerce experience. And I was fortunate enough at that time to be asked to be the vice president of home furnishings under them. I had no e-commerce experience, but I learned a ton from them, picked it up quickly. And Target really got a sense of what it was going to take to survive, in that world where Amazon was such a threat day in and day out. And so right then and there, you started seeing the investments made toward things like the quote unquote omni-channel capabilities that you need. So I can remember back at the time, at first that was buy online, pick up in store. It then moved into ship from store. I think it was around, probably 2017, they made, again, a big $7 billion investment into remodeling all of the stores, redesigning them architecturally for things like advanced curbside pickup opportunities. They started rolling that out. They went into ship. They brought in a guy by the name of Arthur Valdez to run supply chain, who was ex-Amazon. So at the end of the day, they really got the punchline to the joke. And so if you really look back, it's been 7 years that they've been investing in all of these capabilities, which as the pandemic's come to light in 2020, has really set them up for success. And I think enabled them to excel faster than others. I think, as I've said in my writing a few times, they were really 2 to 3 years ahead of Walmart's trajectory, which is why I think you've seen them supersede them this year as well. And it's all, when you look back to the decisions they made, that I just, recounted there.
And one of the things we've talked about a bunch of times on the podcast is why it takes a crisis for some retailers to innovate. And I think, Chris, to your point, the retailers that kind of got what was going on in omni-channel, or what I like to call harmonized retail, were so much better positioned. But Ann, why do you think retailers, or so many, seem not to have gotten it earlier?
Well, I mean, I think that it goes back to a lot about what you wrote about in this last chapter of your book, Steve. I mean, to go out and be innovative, especially as a large-scale retailer, you have to be willing to put yourself out there and make some mistakes. And that's not been something that, even though people talk about failing fast and you hear that at conferences and things from these large-scale retailers, there's not a culture of being able to fail in a lot of these scenarios. And so I think that, now with the pandemic, it forced those R&D projects that were 3 to 5 years in the future, things like curbside pickup, it forced them to go out there. They have a little bit more grace, I think, from the consumer and from the market, because we were in a pandemic and nobody was expecting perfection. Right. But I think that, it's really important that especially as we continue on and learn from this pandemic, that people are focused on, the attempts, what the strategy was to go to market, what was involved in that as kind of your metrics for success, rather than whether or not the program itself was successful, and really identifying what you learned from what you put out in front of the customer.
When I think of Target, there's been a couple of things that have happened in the COVID era. And one of this is, as a retailer, you were either hit with a sledgehammer or a shockwave. The sledgehammer of closures, or the shockwave of demand. And Target kind of fits into the essential retailer category, and maybe had some tailwind behind it. Do you think that's been a big contributor, or do you think it was years in the making that they could be positioned well enough to take advantage of the dynamism, to put it politely, of what the COVID era brought early on, and then continues to deliver in terms of what kind of retailer you are and how ready you are to handle the challenges of the COVID era?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Michael. I think it's a little bit of both, and I'll say why. I mean, I think the essential retailer thing definitely has helped. The analogy I use is like, if you're playing blackjack, sometimes it's just really good when you sit at the table and the dealer busts. And I think that's what you're seeing a lot when you look at, how retail has responded to COVID. But you also have to be sitting at the table, in sort of the right way. And the element that I would put there is I actually think what you're seeing more so than anything is a revalidation that a one-stop shop matters. And there's really not that many places you can do that. I mean, if you look at it, it's really only Target and Walmart. And so the fact that you've got the essential designation with groceries combined with everything else at a time period when you're consolidating your trips out of safety, and because you don't have any other options, you're sitting at the table at quite honestly the right time. Now, with that said, and we talked about it before, Target's put into place some of the great things that they needed to do relative to, even say what a Walmart has done. And I mean, you look at things like we didn't talk about, like the Shipt acquisition. There's still growth to come from that. Not only
that was a really savvy move, that the vertical integration, right? To square that circle, so to speak, of the cost of a third party versus bringing it in house and then turning it into a profit center, which I thought 100%. Was genius, really. Yeah.
And we don't know where that's going yet. I mean, I talked about that in one of my latest articles for Forbes too, where we still don't know where third-party delivery and third-party marketplaces end up going, 10 to 15 years out in this landscape of retail. So they've made a lot of brilliant moves, but at the same time, they've just been in the right place at the right time, but they've been the one to capitalize on it too.
And it feels like we've had 5 years of innovation in 10 months. You both work in the innovation field. As Steve said, we've been talking about innovation for the entire first season here, and how hard it is, and how some are more successful than others. What lessons have you learned in this kind of acceleration of innovation that you could share with our listeners? Like, what are the things that you knew going into the COVID era that were either reinforced or that were new lessons that dawned upon you that we can take away from this experience and help retailers grow for what's next?
I think it's funny. We were just kind of talking about this, and one thing that I was made, I think, more aware of that I didn't realize before the pandemic was just how this whole process of discovery is changing. I think early on, we always talked about, one of the core tenets of stores and the physicality of stores was to discover new product. And I think that we look at the rise of Facebook and Instagram shops, and just how that's changed throughout the pandemic, and how many people have grown more comfortable, like you were talking, Michael and Steve, at the beginning of, now I if I can order my groceries online, what else can I order online? So you're seeing more activity in purchase, everything from snacks to, a ring that you found on Instagram. Now you're ordering that direct from the company instead of, needing to go to a mall or to a department store to have those experiences. So I think that's one area in particular. And I think you see companies like Target too, who are leading, like they have great social teams. That's another area that I think as we look into 2021, Kate Abbott, one of the leaders of their social team there, is incredibly focused on what's that shopping experience going to be like when the Target store, is now on Instagram and on Facebook, and how are you having discovery happen across those channels? And I think that's going to be another trend and innovation that we continue to see in the next year. And again, Target, I think one of those who's uniquely positioned for that as well.
So interesting to watch. When I talk to retail leaders, they tell me that their stores are now a destination shop. Like, people come in, they know what they're looking for. They don't dwell because they don't feel like it's smart to dwell and hang out and discover. They come with purpose. The conversion rates are through the roof. The basket sizes are huge. And then they split. They I came, I saw, I bought. But they don't browse, right? They don't stop in to see what's new in the assortment. So I think it'll be interesting to see if the social media is filling a gap today, or if it has a new role tomorrow when in the post-COVID era. Interesting.
So I wonder, I know my crystal ball has been in the shop for a while because it's very broken. But do you have a view as to which behaviors are likely to persist post-pandemic? Because on the one hand, I feel like there's clearly a role for stores in many areas, but people just don't feel safe right now to go do the browsing like Michael talked about, or work with a sales associate or whatever it might be. But there's obviously been this accelerated discovery and adoption of certain technologies. How do you think about how that's likely to sort itself out, say, by the end of next year?
Yeah, I mean, I think to answer that question, I think the fun thought experiment I've liked doing, and I wrote about this in my latest piece for Forbes, where I talked about, I think the piece was titled "My 5 Holiday Wishes for 2021." I think the point that Anne is saying is really interesting in the sense of, when you start thinking about the online evolution, discovery of product and even the inspiration around product, the things you used to go to physical stores for, is being done better online now through things like Instagram, almost in the way that Instagram, and lots of people have said this, is becoming the new mall. And so that's something important to think about. And then the other thing I think that the pandemic has shown is that same-day delivery is now a really important thing. Michael, we talked about this before the podcast started, but people are now acclimated to the expectation that they can get groceries, but really anything same day. And so same day delivery now, and Steve, you'll appreciate this, is now like a merchandisable event that you can now merchandise to, that you couldn't merchandise to before. And that's up in the funnel in terms of people's purchase criteria. And so the thought experiment that's really interesting is, okay, now let's advance forward and think about, what does that mean for Facebook? I talked about third-party delivery before, but my wish is almost, imagine if Facebook got together with Instacart or Shipt in some way. And so as you're discovering all of this product, that product that you're discovering is from the quote unquote, as Carl Boutet likes to say, not Instacart, but Instamart, where it's a marketplace of all these things that you have the confidence that you can get same day. And so then on that platform, what that essentially means is you can get all of your discovery-based wants, but all of your basically, search, peck, and destroy needs all from the same platform. And all with the confidence that it's going to happen pretty reliably. That's a pretty interesting thing to think about, because what it means for stores in the long run, is pretty telling, especially for certain segments of retail. So again, you come back to, what do physical stores mean? I mean, it all comes down to, well, what does the locational aspect of that entity mean within the jobs that people have to do every single day? And that's where I think you're going to still see a lot of disruption as people try to grapple with that question. And Facebook just becomes really powerful. I mean, I'd close with this. I think 4 million people are born every year. There's been a lot of changes on Instagram lately. They've introduced, shopping right on their homepage. Some people have complained about it. But if you stop and think about it, those 4 million people that are new to it every year, they don't know any differently.
Right.
And that thing is pretty entrenched. And so will this behavior happen? I kind of think it will.
So I'm glad you brought up your 5 wishes piece for Forbes. And I know you guys have riffed on a lot of things. One of the ones you brought up, and I know you've, Chris, you've written about this, and you and Ann have talked about it on your podcast, is holiday wish number 4 is mall owners hold a 2-day all hands on deck convention with retail CEOs. And I just love picturing that.
Can you imagine that? Yeah.
So do we.
But what can malls do to reinvent themselves?
I think the malls have to, I think you're seeing it on 2 fronts, right? Like, it's funny to me that a lot of the malls that I would say, quote unquote, are being successful, like, they've pivoted themselves to even calling themselves experience centers. Like, if you talk to Mall of America or even American Dream out east, that's what they're saying now. They're saying we're not malls, we're experience centers. And that's right, because, the opportunity cost of shopping is doing something that is more experiential, something that's, an activity, so to speak. So I think on the one side you have that. But at the end of the day, too, there are still people that like physical retail. There are still people who want to go shopping. God knows when this is over, people are going to want to do that. The trick is, how do you bring economies of scale to malls in the way that hasn't been there before? Before it was all about providing 4 walls and a parking lot. But now you've got to get into technological infrastructure and architectural infrastructure that gets those economies of scale. So, like, what are those things? Well, it's things like communal shipping, concierge services for returns, buy online, pick up in store, curbside pickup, maybe, like universal mobile shopping applications like the Disney Magic Band when you go, to Disneyland. Those are all the things that have to happen. But the trick is, and the point of that article was, who's the leader, right? It's like me trying to learn how to dance for my wedding. Like, is my wife leading or is it me? Who's going to do that when you start talking mall operators and all the retailers that are operating under that hood? it becomes really problematic. Then you start talking data integrations to make all those things happen. But if those physical entities are going to survive in the way that they need to be combo experiential centers with retail, all within the flow of people's lives in a convenient, efficient way, somebody's got to break through that, stand up and lead and pull all those people together.
I would just add on to the end of what Chris said too. I think you take a look at what the marketplaces are doing, and if malls kind of think marketplace first and physical mall second, that's kind of I would say the framework for how I'd be thinking about what my mall or experience center is going to look like and how it's going to function the next couple of years. Because if the malls themselves aren't able to do it, the marketplaces might become malls, and those will have a much more well-oiled machine than the physical malls trying to, piecemeal something together in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I did a talk for a commercial real estate group a little while back, and I got asked the question about whether malls were going to go the way of the moderate department stores. I certainly think there are a huge number of challenges. What's so interesting to me, and I guess part of what you guys said about who's really going to organize this, is it's not like we just woke up during the pandemic and realized that traffic to malls is declining. When I was at Sears, I left Sears in 2003. Like, we had been worried about that for years, right? So it's just so interesting whether we're talking about mall operators or legacy retailers, where these trends are obvious for years, yet for whatever reason, as I often say, is like they sat around and watched the last 20 years happen to them. So any general advice, particularly in this incredibly uncertain, volatile environment we find ourselves going into in 2021, in terms of how to get organizations to make progress?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you and Ann just said there, I think is really interesting. I mean, if you look at malls, you're right. Like, it's almost like a death by a thousand cuts. It just continues to happen, and you bring that Facebook discussion into it again, and that continues to exacerbate it. But you just have to start fresh. I mean, I think my favorite thing from 2021, and you talk about like VUCA. I think VUCA is the term you use, inside, in the last chapter of your book. The cool thing about 2020 is that that's happening. Like, we're all in that situation. It's almost like the movie 40-Year-Old Virgin, where every retailer is a virgin for the first time again, trying to figure this out. But that's the mindset you have to take. And if you think back to what that's actually like, you don't know what the hell you're doing whenever you're trying to do it. But you have to be doing it and trying to figure out the answers. So, like, even as Ann was alluding to, like, malls have never even been online, if you think about it. How does that make sense? Like, it doesn't. And there's some cool companies like Centennial trying to figure that out. But like, that is what needs to happen. And people need to start putting one foot in front of the other on experimentation if they're going to hope to get anywhere. Otherwise, like, I hate to say it, but you're just going to stay a virgin forever. And, or worst case, you are probably going to lose in the long run. Yeah,
I still sometimes, and I mentioned this in my book, I still sort of think about that scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail where there's the fight with the Black Knight, and it keeps saying, it's just a flesh wound. It's just a flesh wound, right? I mean, the death by a thousand cuts, I think is exactly right. Well, there's so much more we could talk to you guys about, but alas, we're coming up on our time. But I wanted to thank you for coming on the Remarkable Retail podcast. I encourage everybody to go check out the writing, the podcasts, the events, the videos, you name it. Check out Emma, the intern, who's usually on those videos. Probably should have had her on today. I hope she's not going to be mad at us. But
she's your biggest fan, by the way. I think she might be your number one super fan.
Oh my God! Well, but just truly, guys, thanks. Happy New Year. Good luck for 2021, and I'm sure we'll see you somewhere, someplace, at some time.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks for having us.
Steve, one of my reflections on listening to the great interview, such great talents and so articulate and kind of, putting, the sitting seat at the poker table, the blackjack table, hoping the dealer goes bust. My takeaway from that, because we spent a lot of time on Target because of their pedigree in Target, was that even big companies can lose their way and regain it again. But it's hard work. It's nonstop. Even for big professional companies who have the resources to hire lots of people, lots of smart people, like Ann and Chris and great consultants like yourself or whoever, you still lose your way. It's still hard work. Innovation is hard work, right?
Absolutely. And I think one of the particular problems with large companies, and certainly folks like Clayton Christensen have talked about this in terms of the innovator's dilemma, is that when you get to be so big, you're worried about protecting what you already have, even if it's not working very well. It's hard to turn the battleship. And I think another particular problem that's really emerged over the last few years is you've got all sorts of different competitors nipping at your heels, right? So it's not necessarily that Target's going to be put out of business by Amazon or Walmart. It's that, well, there's this new online only company that's going after part of the home category or part of the beauty business or what have you. So it's a lot easier today for businesses to be sustainable, scalable at much lower scale than was true 10 or 15 years ago, largely like the internet.
Merchants and Target saying, hey, our razor blade sales are down this month consistently. What? Oh, there's this thing called, Dollar Shave Club. What's that all about? They won't add up to anything. And then, things add up. And as you say, nibbling around the edges, but eventually, as we said, death by 1,000 cuts, or with one large broadsword, as in Monty Python, right?
Well, and part of what I think we've seen with Target, Walmart, Nordstrom, a few other companies, is they've both developed their own private brands to occupy some of those micro segments, so they don't risk losing, maybe relatively small share in the scheme of things, but they don't risk losing share to some of those insurgent brands, or they carry some of those brands. So we see Quip and Casper and others, Goalie, a bunch of these relatively small brands, but ones that are growing very quickly. So not only are they protecting some of their market share, but they may be attracting that newer, younger, more leading edge customer to their brand. So you've, I think, got to be willing to compete with yourself. You've also got to be willing to take some chances on those products, and probably not everything they've developed in their private label business or that they've done partnerships with is going to work out. So again, to the point Chris and Ann make, it's that constant experimentation.
Well, listen, even companies as big as Target can make mistakes. They came to Canada and blew out with a fury, kind of a business school guide of how not to go into a new country. I mean, it was a big shakeout, so we won't dwell on it. But Target is no longer in Canada after a $5 billion write-down.
But don't you think that's? I mean, to me, in a way, lots of great companies make mistakes for all sorts of reasons. But I wonder if the Target lesson is also a bit of a lesson in humility, right? Like they had this amazing machine going in the United States, and then they go, oh well, Canada's not that different, so we'll just basically replicate or do the easier thing by acquisition or whatever. And it turns out that they didn't understand what they didn't understand.
Well, there's a freight load of lessons to take away from it. That's a big one, is that, Canada is not just another U.S. state, even notwithstanding the population size, that there's differences, right? And, it's, as I summarized in my writings, too much, too soon, too fast. And, there's a long litany of lessons around, they bought Zellers, who I used to work for as part of Hudson's Bay and Mass Merch, but then closed the stores for 18 months to renovate them and said, we'll be back. It gave everybody a running start, literally, because they said, well, it doesn't matter. You won't catch us anyway. It became a turtle in the hair. Anyway, we could spend an entire podcast on the lessons learned. I'm sure Target has taken them close to heart as well. Speaking of lessons learned, last couple of things, reflect for us and for the listeners on the 8 essentials. And we talked about it as we got to the middle of the podcast and talked about what the role of the 8 essentials were, table stakes versus differentiators. But in your mind, are the 8 essentials, can you use them as a map, make some ticks on a box, or what's the role in your mind of the 8 essentials we've spent so much time talking about?
Well, my general advice is that, it's unlikely, I think, that all of them will be equally important at the same time for every retailer. But I do think most of them are relevant to any retailer that wants to mount a transformation. But certainly you need to go through and assess which of them will be most impactful for your business, and to the extent that you could end up with a pretty significant transformation program, think about which building blocks you need to put in place. So, your mileage may vary, but I certainly think that, you need to go through and kind of customize it for your unique situation. But all of them are valid. So it's not a paint by numbers program. It's not a sequential thing or a prescription or even, a catchy acronym that you can go like, oh, let me go and check off the box against it. So,
right.
So in that way, what I say towards the end of the book is that it's not a map, because a map's only going to get us to places we've been before, where we've really been able to lay out the steps. And I think, again, because things are so changing so quickly, that's unlikely to be true. But I definitely think it's more of a compass that will point you in the right direction. And then you need to figure out your own journey there based upon your own situation, your capabilities, your budgets, et cetera.
Your last thought in the book, and then I want to talk about what we've got in mind for the listeners for season 2 of the podcast is, it is the case that, and we heard it loud and clear from Target, their success today is predicated on investments made decades ago. But you end on a happy note. In other words, I can't turn back time. The listeners can't turn back time. But is it always still an opportunity to begin innovation and investing?
Well, I certainly like to think so. I'm sure there are situations where retailers are beyond redemption, that they've started too late. And I often say, until Elon Musk invents a time machine, we're going to have to start where we are. But I often close my keynotes, and I close the book with this Chinese proverb, which is, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. It's not useful to engage in self-flagellation about coulda, woulda, shoulda. All of us have that, not only in our business lives, but in our personal lives, I'm sure. But the thing is to start where you are, be really candid, in your assessment of the reality of your situation, and get started. The thing I think that's so challenging today, and it's a delicate balance, right, between taking a big leap that might be incredibly risky, or doing so in a more deliberate fashion, I guess. But I think for most retailers, it's going to be somewhere in between, right? There's going to be some big leaps you have to take, and there are going to be plenty of small things you're going to need to play around with. And it's really that portfolio approach, as I think we've talked about a couple of times.
Well, it's the balance of it's like the agile approach, right? In other words, you can't wait a year to perfect this thing. Let's get it out there. Let's learn versus let's make some big bets, right? So it's those two, not competing, but actually complementary ideas. All right, let's talk about season 2. Let's give everyone a bit of a preview. So season 1, we've kind of followed the narrative of the book, and it's meant to be, if you're listening to it now or listening to it in 2023, it's as valid then as it was now. What have we got in mind for season 2? We've been talking about it, but share your thoughts on how we're going to approach our next season of the podcast.
Well, I'm really looking forward to it, because I think we can mix up the way we do things. I don't see, as you point out, we're not following a particular narrative flow like we are in the book, or delving deep into a particular framework. We can bring on interesting personalities and build an episode around that. We can talk about current events and hot themes. So what I hope we can do is, certainly we've got the view of what it takes to be remarkable as kind of a backdrop to our conversation, but we'll be able to dig into whatever is important and hot in a given moment, sometimes with one guest, sometimes with multiple guests, sometimes just you and I talking. So, for example, we're going to have Hubert Joly, the former CEO of Best Buy, on. So we'll have some big names, some smaller names, and everything in between.
Well, what I can guarantee the listener is the content will be compelling and interesting, and pretty nonstop. We'll be releasing episodes each and every week, starting on Groundhog Day. So we take a bit of a hiatus between this episode and the next, but then we kick it off on Groundhog Day and an exciting 2021. So listen, let's leave this episode here, our final episode of season 1. As I said, we're taking a brief hiatus, but we'll be back with season 2. Steve, for now, read us out.
Well, if you like what you heard, you can subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Please rate and review, and be sure and recommend to a friend or colleague. I'm Steve Dennis. You can learn more about me on stephenpdennis.com, and be sure and look for my insights on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Forbes.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, producer and host of the Voice of Retail podcast. You can learn more about me on www.meleblanc.co. Steve, have a safe week ahead, and I'll see you on the other side for season 2.
Can't wait.